Hi. So, you may know me as that one guy who didn't like The Last Airbender. I know I haven't made any videos since my Inmost review, and oh yeah, that was 2 years ago, but don't worry. If you were looking for more asinine hot takes from me, I may just have one that is even more controversial than The Last Airbender being average. Elden Ring is just okay. I know, everyone loves Elden Ring. How could I not love Elden Ring too? And I will get to all that, I promise. But really, I wanted this video to be about a bit more than just Elden Ring. I want to talk to you about Thymesia, the actual best Souls-like to come out this year, and my current game of the year, that you might not have even heard of until now. Did he say The Last Airbender was average? Really, when I was first conceiving making a video on this topic, I wanted it to be just me talking about how absolutely amazing Thymesia is. But I realized that not only can I knock out two birds with one stone, since I already wanted to let some of my thoughts out about Elden Ring, I can also really emphasize Thymesia's strengths by showing how it does so many things better than what a lot of other people call the best Souls-like ever made. Thymesia has, in my opinion, when compared to Elden Ring, better boss design, better level design, better enemy design, and, dare I say it, better combat than Elden Ring. Elden Ring might be one of the bigger disappointments for me this year, and honestly it nearly put me off from trying out other Souls-likes, especially the FromSoft ones, but thankfully I decided to give Thymesia a solid shake, as hesitant as I was. As an outsider to the genre, having Elden Ring be my first real intro into Souls-likes had left me very skeptical about anything else with a Souls-like tag attached to it. I mean, I played Darksiders 3 and Jedi Fallen Order beforehand, if those can kinda count. I also gave Bloodborne a shot, but lost interest pretty quickly. Everyone but me seemed to be raving about how Elden Ring was Game of the Year, Game of the Generation, and, I quote, Game of my entire lifetime. While I viewed it as kind of average, it's just okay. If I viewed what other people see as one of, if not the greatest game of all time as just okay, surely I wouldn't end up liking anything else that everyone considered to be lesser, right? Well, as you can probably tell by the title and thumbnail, this isn't the case. Now, to get into why I think all of this, as well as why I am so glad I decided to try out Thymesia, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, here is my little essay on why Thymesia is the actual best Souls-like of the year, and my 2022 Game of the Year so far. As a quick side note, I have not played any other major 3D Souls-likes aside from just Elden Ring. So while Sekiro might have better combat than Thymesia, and Bloodborne might have better lore and boss fights and whatever else, yeah, okay, great. I haven't played those games, so I'm not really at liberty to compare them and talk about them. I'm sure they're great, I'm sure they deserve all the universal praise they've gotten, and sorry to disappoint anyone that wanted me to compare Thymesia's combat to Sekiro, or the setting to Bloodborne, but I just don't know anything about those games, so moving on. Also, this video is going to go into spoiler territory when it comes to bosses, but I won't be showing them off until later with a spoiler warning. I also won't be mentioning the lore of Thymesia basically at all, because it's just much better to be put together for yourself. However, I will be showing parts of all three areas throughout this video, so if you're sensitive to that kind of thing like I am, I recommend tabbing out and just listening to this video like you would a podcast. So, level design. Let's just start there. Level design in Thymesia is, overall, very solid. For the most part it's linear, it's straightforward, and it's hard to get lost, but that doesn't mean there aren't still tidbits of lore or even a certain NPC to find. As a sentiment you're going to hear me say probably a few times in this video, what's there isn't grand or complex, but it's good. You're never going to get lost during a level, but that also plays into another strength of the game, which is keeping a very solid pacing. Is that going to be for everyone? Admittedly, no, not at all. I know part of the appeal of other Souls-like games is the fact that you do get lost at times. As someone with a god-awful sense of direction, however, mostly linear design that still rewards exploration is perfect for me. This game doesn't really have traditional side quests either. Instead, you end up backtracking parts of each level, at least somewhat, in what are called subquests, which are unlocked after beating a level, albeit with different enemies, new lore to find, and you do have new pathways unlocked with each one, and old pathways can be blocked off, so it's halfway like a new level. There are some subquests with completely new areas, however. There isn't much to them besides that, you just go through the same or a similar area again, fighting slightly different enemies, but more content in Thymesia is a plus in itself. I honestly like how you can just jump into an area and start the side quest and find new lore without having to do anything complicated. I will say that I infinitely prefer it to how Elden Ring decided to do its quest lines. Oh great, I got Blythe to jump down. Now I need to find Darrowil, and you're just not going to give me any direction. Okay. And now I need to find Blythe again, who is somewhere in Siofra River. That's all you're going to give me. You're really not going to tell me anything other than find the Albinoric woman, Gideon. Even after I've already found her.
Find the Albinoric woman.
Oh, I'm just supposed to find Millicent at the mountaintop of the Giants, and you won't even tell me that. Oh, I talked to Ronnie, but the quest didn't progress. Maybe Rogier knows something. Oh, you're sending me back to Ronnie, where the quest will continue as normal, and that didn't happen the first time for no fucking reason? Yeah, I could go on about how badly Elden Ring handles its quest lines for quite a while. Don't give the player anything to keep track of quests, don't mark anything on the map, do make every quest require talking to every NPC involved at least twice for some reason, meaning you may end up missing quests just because you thought the dialogue was over. Not to mention, if you need to find an NPC in an area you've already been to, and don't know you're supposed to find them there, you're never going to find them without backtracking potentially the entire map or looking up a guide. God forbid you end up killing Rykard and end up missing everyone's quest who was in the manor because the game encouraged you to explore and find the boss, or just happen to miss Alexander and his entire questline because he's stuck on some random part of the map. But I'll stop there, for now. Long story short, I do not like how Elden Ring handled its quests at all. I find it almost astounding that the developers decided to put the quests in the game in the first place when they ended up giving them the minimum amount of effort required to even function in the first place. Anyway, where were we? Right, level design. Most of everything else regarding level design in Thymesia is straightforward. Shortcuts are simple, open this door from the other side, and beacons act as this game's bonfires, which I'll just be calling chairs. Chairs are actually set at pretty much the perfect pace in this game. You should be coming across a new one every 10 minutes or so, and if you aren't finding a new one, there's often a shortcut nearby to rest at an old one. And yes, unlike Elden Ring, there's always a checkpoint right before a boss. No more absolutely pointless backtracking like FromSoft games apparently make you do. My god, that sounds awful. This is actually an issue throughout a lot of Elden Ring. While the open world has plenty of sites of grace, and while some parts of dungeons will have them evenly spaced out, others will not. The Academy is one of the more egregious examples I can think of, specifically the rooftop section, which I have issues with on its own, with how easy it is to fall off, especially against such annoying enemies, but you go such a long time without any checkpoints, and it's incredibly grating to go through such a long section just once, let alone multiple times if you end up dying. There's also no checkpoint before Renala herself, making the walk back to her if you die even more annoying due to how tedious the first phase is. And while the Academy is one of the bigger offenders of this for the main dungeons, this is a problem with a lot of the smaller dungeons too. And don't get me wrong, I don't mind that you're supposed to complete catacombs and caves and whatever else all in one go. I think that's totally fine that you get sent back to the start once you die. But I really hate the dungeons where you don't have a checkpoint before the boss and only a site of grace at the very start. You better hope you can beat the boss first try, or else you're going to be wasting a lot more time walking back, and it's not going to be fun. I have other, more minor issues with the smaller dungeons, such as the majority of them being way too linear and lacking in exploration, as well as being way too similar in terms of not only design, but also visual design. But at least this isn't ever an issue with the larger dungeons like Leyndell or the Academy. Going through the exact same catacombs 20 times with the layout being the exact same at parts, and fighting the same enemies all just gets a bit grating, though. I don't want to harp on Elden Ring's environmental detail or visual design too much though, because outside of the smaller caves and dungeons, Elden Ring's world is pretty diverse, though I do still have issues with it. Locations in the overworld are varied, but at parts I would consider the transition from one area to another pretty jarring, such as going from Limgrave to Caelid, but I suppose that's often the objective in order to communicate to the player that they better be prepared if they want to explore in this area. It is to the point where I feel like areas just don't look or feel like they're part of the same world, and the open world itself lacks any meaningful cohesion, but at least the design of the areas themselves are pretty well done. A little empty in most areas for my taste, but well done nonetheless. Thymesia, in comparison, really only has 3 different areas, but I will absolutely commend the environmental artists for making each space unique while still feeling like they exist within the same world. There's the poisonous, dreary, almost gross atmosphere of the Sea of Trees, the red, bloody, hostile, but also beautiful design of the Royal Garden, and the admittedly standard and kind of forgettable Hermes Fortress, which I would consider the worst of the 3 visually, although it does have its moments. These areas are all great on their own, even the Hermes Fortress, but they become even more interesting when you start putting pieces of the lore together. And honestly, you don't really need me to tell you how great the visual design of this game is because, well, you can see it for yourself right now. So now we get into what I think is Thymesia's biggest strength, its combat. In Thymesia, you have a handful of different attacks. Your standard sword attacks, a deflect, claw attacks, feather darts, and plague weapons, which can kind of be seen as secondary weapons that you take from enemies, but they only have 1 to 2 attacks. Think of them as this game's Ashes of War. So every enemy has effectively 2 health bars, a white and a green health bar. The white health bar works the same as armor from basically any other game, while the green health bar, called wounds, is the enemy's actual health. But for the sake of the video, I'll just be calling them white and green health bars. If you want to kill an enemy, you have to lower their white health bar first, and then their green health bar all the way before you can finally pull off a finisher. However, the caveat in this game is that if you go a handful of seconds without damaging the enemy, their white health bar will start to increase back to the max of their current green health. This means that if you try to play passively, like poking the enemy just 1 or 2 times, and then backing off, that white health bar will go back up to full. Instead, the game rewards playing aggressively because without it, you won't be dealing any permanent damage. And both health bars are decreased with different kinds of damage. The white health bar is damaged with the normal attack damage, which is dealt with your sword, deflects, and most of the plague weapons, while the green health bar is damaged with your claw attacks, your standard one being the right trigger, and a smaller handful of plague weapons, such as the knife. There's also the feathers, which can deal minimal damage from a distance, but are also the most reliable way to stop an enemy's critical attack, which are unparryable. You can also hold the right trigger to charge the claw attack, which when landed steals the enemy's weapon as a one-time use plague weapon. All of this means that the game is encouraging you to use everything at your disposal. No more spamming jump attacks to stagger enemies like in Elden Ring, or dodging to the side and swiping over and over again. You have to add variance to your gameplay if you want to succeed. Speaking of, let's go ahead and make another official complaint against Elden Ring here. While I didn't hate or even dislike the combat in Elden Ring, it really pushes you towards a passive playstyle. I'm sure that style of gameplay is fun for some people, but it sure as hell makes the game not nearly as fun as other more aggressive titles for me. For one, there's no parry mechanic outside of just a handful of weapons in Elden Ring, the main one being the shield, and an offensive mechanic like parrying being mostly tied to a defensive weapon is a problem in and of itself. Elden Ring's stamina system also means you can only get a few attacks off before you're forced to wait for it to regen. This system, while I understand has its uses for making gameplay more methodical, punishes aggression rather than rewarding it. Combine this with the fact that the stagger gauge isn't visible, and certain bosses like Melania and Margit can end up comboing attacks into each other at points while not doing so at others for seemingly no reason at all, leads the player waiting and scouting out a boss's moves during potential punish windows. The bosses set the pace of each battle, and way more times than not, the pace of battle for the player is passivity. In Thymesia, however, the player is the one to set the pace of battle. You can be nearly as aggressive as you want in this game, due to the fact that you can dodge or deflect fairly quickly out of your standard attacks, meaning you don't need to wait for the enemy to pull off a specific move or be positioned in the correct way for you to apply pressure. If the enemy starts attacking, deflect or dodge, and if you mess up the timing for it or commit too much without watching the enemy's tells, you still get punished for it. You can play very aggressively, but the game will punish you for playing too aggressively and not thinking about your own safety. And this is all without even mentioning the skill tree. Deflecting deals damage on its own, but you can also upgrade the dodge to give you an offensive buff, make it so that you leap off of an enemy when you dodge towards those unparryable attacks I mentioned, add a feather dash to instantly close the distance on enemies, restore the energy you need for plague weapons when deflecting or attacking, use an intercept wing instead of a feather, which has a much shorter range to interrupt attacks but with a longer window for success and rewards being close to the enemy, and much more. Did I mention some plague weapons can give you offensive buffs as well? And I'm sure that Elden Ring fans love that for so many of the builds in the game, you have to play either at a distance or extremely passively and slow. But that just isn't fun for me. Why circle enemies and dodge only to do the same 2 or 3 attacks over and over again when I could be pulling off combos in Thymesia? As I said before, Elden Ring can be methodical at times, but it simply isn't worth the trade-off of how slow you have to play, at least not for me. And yes, you heard me right, Thymesia has fucking combos. For example, I can use my Katar to stab and dodge backwards away from the enemy, which leaves me at the perfect distance to use my whip, which when hit from far enough away, will grapple me towards the enemy, which then allows me to use my unlockable mid-air claw swipe, which deals massive damage. Or I can use the twin swords to start a multi-hit combo, dodge the enemy's attack into my own dodge attack, deflect the enemy's next hit, and then swap to my knife, which has halved cast time after it deflects. Or I can throw the hatchet far away from the enemy, use the feather dash to close the distance, and then use the hammer's whirlwind, which also reduces damage taken while casting, to finish off the combo and leave the enemy vulnerable for a claw attack. Or I can use the sight's double swipe to knock the enemy back, then I can follow up with a guaranteed greatsword hit to knock the enemy down and follow up with claw attacks. Or I can switch around that exact same combo if I need the healing, by first hitting the greatsword, which also reduces incoming damage, to knock the enemy down first, and then follow up with the scythe for lots of safe healing. For all the people that I've seen say fast combat and combos wouldn't work in Souls-like games, here is your proof that you're wrong, and it's fucking fun. And I haven't even really gotten into build diversity either. As I said before, while this game really encourages playing aggressively, there are some different weapons and options in the skill tree that can ease you into things. I can upgrade my deflect to deal more damage, but I can also upgrade it to increase deflect timing while reducing the damage deflect does. This makes that aspect of combat much more approachable and can lower the difficulty of some of the harder bosses if you're not confident in their attack timings. While the short dodge can give an offensive buff when using it at the right time, the long dodge can give you a defensive buff while also covering more distance. You can also select an upgrade that will give you healing whenever you execute an enemy, meaning even if you take some damage beforehand, as long as you play well afterwards, you can sustain yourself while saving your potions for the more drawn-out fights. Now, as you can probably tell, build diversity is somewhat limited compared to games like Elden Ring, but you're still given a fairly solid amount of options that I admittedly underestimated when I first started playing. Everything that Thymesia has, however, is fine-tuned extremely well. Nothing that I've used has ever felt overpowered or underpowered. Except I could probably stand to tune down the knife just a tad, yeah? Contrast that with Elden Ring, where staff builds just destroy the entire game, while other builds struggle way more unless you're using summons. Thymesia is more limiting, but what is there is balanced way better. Geez, I am this far into the video, and I haven't even brought up the bosses yet. Actually, this is going to be your spoiler warning. If you don't want to see any spoilers regarding the bosses in Thymesia, skip to the time that you see on screen right now. Alright, we all good? Good. Let's get into the meat of things. Thymesia has incredible bosses, and when I say incredible, I mean that, at bare minimum, 3 of the 8 bosses are easily better than anything I fought in Elden Ring. Take Oder, for example, the very first boss, and what most would seem to consider the most difficult. He's a lot like Margit in that he does a phenomenal job at teaching the player everything they need to know to succeed in the rest of the game, except he's just way better than Margit. He has a 3-hit combo that you can both dodge and deflect, but other moves that are very close to making you deflect, such as his dash into the double attack. If you can keep up with him and continue to deflect, you're rewarded with punish windows to hit him, while if you try to dodge away, you'll have to spend just as much time reapproaching him once his attack is over, meaning you'll be missing out on damage. His second phase also has a 5-hit attack combo that, while can be reasonably dodged away from with the right timing, can also be deflected for great damage. Either way, you'll need the right timing to either get the damage off from the deflect or the offensive buff from the dodge if you have it. He also has a completely undodgeable critical attack that can only be interrupted with the feather, so if you ended up spending much of the first area dodging critical attacks rather than learning to interrupt them with the feather, as I did on my first playthrough, you're in for a world of hurt. And unlike Margit and the many other bosses of Elden Ring, he doesn't string together attacks in a different way every time as to decentivize aggression, or have delayed attacks, or read your healing, or have moves that you strictly can't punish. Oder doesn't necessarily force you to use everything at your disposal, but the fight extremely encourages it, and you will thrive when you begin to use all of the game's systems against him. And honestly, none of this is to say Margit is a bad introductory fight. If anything, he's the perfect boss to teach the player about all the bullshit they will soon come across as they continue to play, including the terrible boss arena and dealing with the awful dodge delay Elden Ring for some reason implemented. My god, the fucking dodge delay. My problem stems from more than just Margit as a boss, but many of the Elden Ring bosses and enemies that have these same problems. Malenia is, of course, one of these, and in a lot of ways is very similar to Margit, just turned up to 11, and also the perfect example of a boss done horribly. I actually didn't completely dislike Malenia at first, but now after having some time to think on her, and having come across a much better version of that fight in Thymesia, and we'll get to that boss, don't worry, my taste over time has soured quite a bit towards her. I could talk for way longer than I need to about why Malenia is so awfully designed, and part of me wants to, but for the sake of brevity, I'll just go through some of the bullet points about why she's awful, and instead flash some text on the screen of user Loonsy on Reddit, who puts everything wrong with the boss into a much more well thought out comment than anything I could put together. Anyway, here's a lot of what I find wrong with her. She can string together an almost seemingly endless amount of attacks at points, forcing the player to go on the defensive for way too long. Waterfowl dance. How the hell is the player supposed to know to dodge into the attack to prevent dying? And forget dodging the attack completely without hours of experimentation or looking up a guide. She's functionally the highest HP boss in the game considering her healing factor, and that she restores HP between phases, and given how aggressive she is, this makes her a massive difficulty spike to everything else in the game. She's way too overtuned. She can throw out attacks, seemingly at random, that have hyper armor, so when you think you have an opening to attack and flinch her, she'll throw out one of these moves and end you. Her second phase has multiple moves where she jumps into the air, and if you happen to be right beneath her when she does it, you'll have no idea which one she's going for and can't properly prepare or dodge because of it. Her Six Sisters attack requires way too much precision and is difficult to even see. Okay, so all of that out of the way, I did mention earlier that there is a boss that I think is just a better version of Malenia. That boss is Erd. She is the last boss that you gain access to in the game, and is one of the most difficult because of that. Not quite as difficult as Oder in my eyes, but that's also because Oder is fought very early on before the player has become better at the game, and is also fighting with much more limited tools when it comes to plague weapons and the skill tree. If Erd was the first boss you had to face instead, I would consider her sufficiently more difficult. Anyway, I digress. What does Erd do right that Malenia doesn't? Well, for starters, all of those bullet points that I brought up for Malenia, gone. Erd has none of those issues, and I honestly struggle to think of any other than some of her thrusting attacks look vaguely similar, but even those you'll begin to learn the difference of rather quickly. Aside from this, she's what I would consider a perfect boss fight. She's constantly aggressive, and like any other boss in the game, doesn't have any moves with a large amount of end lag that you're meant to punish. While she stays aggressive throughout the entire fight, you're meant to fight aggressively back with deflects and punish her at every window you get. And more so than any other boss or enemy in the game, you do still have to find the right balance between aggression and self-preservation. Play too aggressively and ignore your own safety, and she will surely catch you during an attack. Play too passively, and she'll start dealing damage to you faster than you can deal damage to— What the hell? Yeah, visually, as you can tell, this boss is great. The first time you see her phase transition is genuinely mind-blowing. Her design on its own is very well made, and while most of her attacks aren't super flashy, everything looks and feels very clean, not only giving her this aura of experience and mastery of the sword about her, but also allows the player to distinguish her attacks and react accordingly. I'm looking at you again, Melania, Malekith, Ulcerated Tree Spirit, Horalu— a lot of Elden Ring bosses get this simple step wrong. And I know I spent a lot of time talking about Odor and Erd in particular, but the rest of the bosses are great too. Mutated Odor is properly disgusting and horrifying, with my only fault with that fight being that he really shouldn't be easier than his first fight. This one deserved a second phase, honestly. The Hanged Queen is basically this game's dragon, and her design is really cool, while still being mechanically better than any of Elden Ring's dragons. Varg is downright intimidating. He sounds, feels, and looks powerful, and has the best theme in the entire game. He kind of reminds me of Elemer of the Briar, except his boss arena doesn't ruin the fight. And also, just listen to his theme. And Corvus as the final boss is just thematically perfect, and shows how confident the developers are in their combat system. You face, for possibly the first time for the player, if you haven't fought Erd before the ending, an enemy that is equally as fast and aggressive as you. They give Corvus the exact same moves that you have access to, and it's astounding how well he actually works as a boss mechanically. Because he uses close to every plague weapon, as well as different feather attacks, different claw attacks, and the same 5-hit sword combo you can unlock, the more you experiment with your moveset and skill tree beforehand, something that the game has been pushing you to do since the very first level, the better prepared you will be for this fight. It is genius boss design through and through, and the perfect way to cap off the game. Really, if I were given the chance to— holy shit, what is that? Alright, I've been avoiding them long enough. We gotta talk about the spectacle boss fights. And to put it out there, neither of the two spectacle fights in the game are bad. They're just kind of forgettable. Like, it's cool and all to see God of the Fools and going, what in the hell is that thing, to then starting the next mission and going, I have to fight that thing, only for the fight itself to be fighting smaller enemies as you make your way towards him and then finishing him off with a single button press. Like, he's got some cool attacks for sure, and it is kind of fun the first time, but also kind of a letdown that you aren't actually fighting him, but instead avoiding him as much as possible until you reach the top. Now, Sound of the Abyss is just kind of bad as a fight, and its design is fairly standard. You dodge falling crystals, dodge when it comes out of the ground, hide in this little opening during its sweep attacks, and only against that attack and its headbutt forward can you damage the crystals on its sides. It's very boring, and the only reason I died to it more than once was because I didn't realize I could avoid the sweep attack by hiding in the opening behind me. This is definitely the easiest fight in the game. It doesn't really challenge you in any way, other than just dodging at the correct times, but at least the boss arena is cool, so it's not all bad. So this game has 2 mediocre boss fights, when the rest are fantastic. I'm very okay with that. Thankfully, you can also just avoid the spectacle fights entirely if you wanted to, and they're both easy enough to beat, so at least they don't overstay their welcome. While we're on the topic though, I should go ahead and bring up the rest of the issues I have with Thymesia, as few as they are. I think one of the biggest things that's an issue for me, while this game has a pretty good amount of enemy variety given the length, you don't actually come across those enemies in equal amount. And don't get me wrong, it makes sense that you're not coming across the big hammer bros 10 times a level, and in return they act as mini-bosses with big health bars, right? Well, the problem with that is because you only come across those enemies every so often, you're fighting the more standard enemies quite a bit. The second level in particular has just a tad too many shield enemies and a lot of scythe enemies towards the second half. The first area definitely has too many knife and hatchet enemies, and all three areas have plenty of halberd enemies. This in itself isn't really that big of a deal, but it does give rise to another problem. Because you come across so many halberd enemies, for example, you're basically guaranteed to have your halberd maxed out by the end of your playthrough, as the shards you need to upgrade your weapons are dropped by the enemies that use them. So if you want to upgrade your Qatar to unlock the secondary attack, or god forbid the secondary effect you get when it's fully upgraded, you're going to have a tough time doing it because you only come across like 4 to 5 Qatar enemies in your entire playthrough, meaning you have to find a Qatar enemy to grind against if you want the upgrades. Having some weapons that are basically guaranteed to be maxed out while having to grind out other weapons is just strictly imbalanced. As an example of this, while trying to get footage with the hammer combo from way earlier in the video, I had to grind out hammer shards from the same enemy for almost 20 minutes just to unlock the swing attack. 20 minutes to get 2/5 of a weapon upgraded. I feel like this issue would be solved if there was some sort of shop in the Philosopher's Hill where you could exchange for shards after unlocking them. The Philosopher's Hill, by the way, acts as the hub of Thymesia. Considering Philosopher's Hill isn't really used for, well, anything except for talking to Asimi, this would give it something to justify its existence. You also only get a handful of the weapons towards the very end of the game, mainly the giant sword from Varg and the javelin sword from Erd, and considering this game doesn't have New Game Plus at the time of this review, you really don't have much content left in the game to actually use them with, unless you're just going back through everything for fun. Hopefully New Game Plus is on the way though, and there won't be any problem with this in the future, but for the time being, it is certainly disappointing. The only other flaw that I can think of is I kind of wish that the deflect was a bit more punishing when mistiming it. A failed deflect's animation is over so quickly that, if you're out of range, there's no risk of getting hit from the enemy's follow-up, and you're often able just to deflect again very quickly when you use it too early. Just a slight increase to a failed deflect's end lag would be a bit better to prevent being able to spam it at points. Oh, and the game does lack voice acting outside of grunts and yells, and it's a bit annoying to have to read dialogue during the middle of a boss fight, but that's definitely not a huge deal in the end. And yeah, that's really it for flaws in Thymesia. I still have quite the handful for Elden Ring. In fact, future me will probably just have them scroll by on the screen now. And honestly, I don't want to end this video on just the negatives of Elden Ring, cause like I said, I don't hate it or think it's awful, I just think it's okay. The exploration aspect of the game is incredible, the amount of build diversity is insane, the large majority of the main dungeons are fun to explore, combat is still pretty fun overall, and just the sheer amount of things to do in the game is nice if you need something to pour dozens or hundreds of hours into. And hey, if you're on PC, then a lot of the issues that I've brought up are already fixed through mods, such as the seamless co-op and the lack of a transmog system. I unfortunately made the mistake of buying Elden Ring on PS5, so I don't get that luxury, but I digress. And keep in mind, I don't mean to tell anyone here that they shouldn't buy Elden Ring, or that you need to have the same opinion as me. I'm clearly in the minority here, so if you disagree and think Elden Ring is great, don't worry, everyone else does too. I'm only here to hopefully convince just a couple people to give Thymesia a shot, because I genuinely think this game is amazing and way better than Elden Ring in my eyes. Basically everyone has already decided that Elden Ring is their game of the year, but I don't. I don't know what my game of the year is going to be this time around, at least I'm not 100% certain yet. First it was Legends Arceus, then Horizon Forbidden West, and now Thymesia has taken the crown months later. And honestly, I don't see any other game topping it this year based on what's coming up. Through every step of the way, this game managed to impress me with everything it did. From the soundtrack, to the environment, to the bosses, to the lore, Everything about this game is legitimately great, and I want as many people to experience this game as possible. So if you haven't yet, give Thymesia a shot, and who knows, you may end up loving it as much as I do. Okay, so that was a lot. I initially wanted to make this video shorter than my Avatar review, and well, that didn't work out. I only realized how much I actually had to say about both of these games once I started putting my thoughts into words, but hopefully everything turned out alright in the end. This entire process took a lot of time and effort, so if you like the video and want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, everyone. Peace.